Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Emilia Clarke stars in the true crime drama Above Suspicion. In Pikeville, Kentucky, 1988, Susan Smith, played by Emilia Clarke, is living with her ex-husband, Cash, played by Johnny Knoxville, selling and abusing drugs to get by, hoping to get out of Pikeville whenever she can. She gets her chance when FBI agent Mark Putnam, played by Jack Huston, moves into Pikeville with his family while pursuing a bank robber, and Susan becomes his informant. As Mark's career ascends with Susan's information, the two begin to have an affair that will have devastating and tragic consequences. Above Suspicion is based on Joe Sharkey's 1993 true crime book of the same name, and it's directed by experienced Australian helmer Phillip Noyce, whose career literally spans decades. His credits include the likes of Dead Calm, the two Harrison Ford Jack Ryan thrillers from the 90s, and Salt. So you would think you would be a safe pair of hands for this kind of project. But Above Suspicion arrives with the telltale signs that something has gone very wrong with this movie's production. The first being that it was shot all the way back in 2016, and then it sat on a shelf for 3 years until it finally made it onto any kind of screen in the UAE. That's right, this movie's big premiere theatrical bow was in the United Arab Emirates of all places. If that doesn't tell you this movie was getting buried, I don't know what does. In the 2 years since then, it's gradually managed to eke its way out in most of the world. In the UK, it was released last summer with no publicity whatsoever as a VOD release. And 5 years after it was filmed, it finally arrives now in the US. So I think that tells a story all by itself, especially because this is a major production with lots of recognisable talent in it. It has Emilia Clarke, who since filming this movie has appeared in a Star Wars film and of course appeared in Game of Thrones, two of the biggest franchises in the world, as well as appearing in a number of major projects like Last Christmas, for example. All things that they could have easily released this movie to capitalise upon, but the fact they didn't tells you that they didn't feel the quality was there to actually release it in cinemas. And boy, is there a reason for that, because Above Suspicion is criminally bad. The most important question to ask when it comes to true crime is, why are you telling this story? These are real events, real people, real deaths. That carries a weight and responsibility with it. You can't be careless about it. And so you need to have a good reason for why the audience needs to be told this story. What are you meant to glean and learn from it? If the only reason that you're telling a true crime story is that someone died, you're not doing your job properly. That's a piece of exploitation. That's rubbernecking a tragedy. In concept, Above Suspicion tells a very interesting story. It's the first time that an FBI agent was convicted of murder. That's an important factoid, but it isn't a story in of itself. There has to be more to it than that. But the script for this movie completely forgets that. I don't think it knows why it's specifically telling this story, or what the audience is meant to take away from it. Certainly my understanding of it was, terrible things happen, the end. There's no real investment for the audience in the story, and no real sense of trying to sculpt it into a digestible narrative. And it's not hard to think of a way of reframing this story so that the audience can actually connect with it. You tell it as a straightforward tragedy, as the story of this small town woman who is desperate to get out of this dead-end place, and she sees her opportunity in this FBI guy that is everything that she's ever dreamed of, but then turns out to be exploiting her, which has cataclysmic consequences. Is it simple? Yes. Is it a bit TV movie of the week? Also yes. But you know what? It works because it has a clearly defined protagonist and gives us someone to care about. Above Suspicion, in trying to be morally ambiguous, offers us none of that, because the entire cast, virtually, is unsympathetic and opportunistic. And that means that we have no investment in the story being told. And the movie tries to address this by having Susan talk as a voiceover throughout the entire movie, but instead that just works against the film on multiple levels, especially because they try to insert a degree of self-awareness into the narration. They're aware of the tropes of true crime stories, and she even talks about a telling like the one I just discussed, but also dismisses it and says that she wasn't that kind of person. She wasn't some kind of naive waif, and that is a very simple way of telling that story. But again, that just calls attention to the fact that the movie offers nothing in its place, and also that Susan is not a very clearly defined character if she has to explain her motivations to us constantly throughout the entirety of the movie. What I will give Emilia Clarke credit for is that she is clearly throwing herself into the role. I think that Clarke maybe borders on being a little bit miscast here, but she shows so much enthusiasm. It's almost like someone told her that this was her chance at potentially getting an Oscar, because she just goes 110% through this. Clarke does a decent job with the accent. It's not perfect, but it's not terrible either. At times there is a bit of a leftover Sarah Connor vibe to her performance, which, yeah, given when this was shot, that totally makes sense. But the problem largely exists in the fact that the role is basically a catalogue of abuses, either mentally or physically. There are several scenes in this film where Clarke is reduced to a sobbing, bloodied mess, and I just felt so sorry for her because this movie is giving her virtually nothing and she's trying so hard, but there's virtually no characterization apart from this. It's basically the character being manipulated and abused for 90 straight minutes, and that's about it. And then, on top of that, Clarke has to deliver some of the worst lines of the movie in the voiceover narration, including such unutterable lines like, "I had more sex than a long-eared bunny rabbit." Excuse me? Pardon? She is almost single-handedly trying to make it work, and the film just simply steamrollers her. But at least Clarke is actually giving a performance here, which is more than can be said for Jack Huston in the role of the FBI guy. This is a part that screams for a John Hamm type, someone that is very kind of chiseled, very idealistic, someone that is exactly who you think of as the perfect FBI agent. And then it's revealed that he's just as much of a scumbag as the people that he takes down. Hamm would have nailed that perfectly, or at least someone of his ilk. Jack Huston is a complete blank throughout the entirety of the movie. There is at no point where he seems particularly comfortable in the role, and certainly he doesn't make that much of an impression in it, which is strange considering he's the main character of the movie. This is meant to be a character that you grow to despise over the course of the film, but Huston's blank-faced performance offers no emotional response to the audience whatsoever. He is crucially miscast in this role, and it's a major reason why the film doesn't work as well as it should. I think the rest of the supporting cast try to do their best with relatively limited screen time. Johnny Knoxville acquits himself surprisingly well as Susan's abusive drug dealer ex. It's not too much of a stretch for him, but if you've only seen him in comedies or in stuff like Jackass, this may well surprise you. I think that he does actually have more dramatic chops than he's usually given credit for. Thora Birch is so limited in this movie that frankly she's outacted by her massive wig. You've got reliable, dependable character actors like Kevin Dunn in this as well, but for me the standout would be Sophie Lowe as Kathy Putnam, the FBI agent's wife. She was virtually the only person that I cared about throughout the entire movie, and I think that's because Lowe gives a quietly devastating performance here. She really nails the sense of tragedy about this character. She's someone who was an addict, she was an alcoholic, she was living a fairly rough life, and then she met her husband, and she cleaned herself up, became this perfect wife, raising a family, and then Susan comes into her kitchen, and immediately, right away, she knows that her husband is probably having an affair with her because she's looking at a mirror, she's looking at herself several years ago. And some of the scenes that she shares with Clarke are so brilliant and powerfully played because of that. If the movie consistently hit that, it would have been fantastic. I think that Sophie Lowe has a better sense of the entire material than the filmmakers actually did, and there's a real poignancy to the fact that she is aware of what's going on but feels powerless about it and is caught up in all the ensuing carnage afterwards. Most of the problems with Above Suspicion, though, largely stem from the actual filmmaking itself, which can be squarely placed at the feet of Noyce. Noyce was obviously aware that he was handed a fairly pedestrian script and was determined to spice it up. And let's just say he made some questionable choices to that end. At times it feels like he's taking complete leave of his directorial senses. Now some of this might be because of post-production issues and re-editing, but actually it seems like it's inherent to the film's original photography, and that more indicates that the entire directorial approach was wrong from the outset. What I would argue, and how I felt watching the movie, was that Noyce was directing this like it was an action film, which is totally the wrong fit for this kind of material, especially in the way that scenes are cut and the way that it prioritises those small action beats like the bank robberies or the attacks on Mark's home with a lot of shaky cam, lots of quick cutting. They feel like they've stumbled out of a completely different movie, and it indicates that Noyce is trying to push this into more of a genre direction, like it's a thriller or something, and that just makes it feel like it's being sensationalized. And then on top of that, you've got the way that Appalachia is depicted in this movie. This has been a recurring issue with a number of recent films set in the area, like Hillbilly Elegy, which have been heavily criticised for feeling cliched and stereotypical, but Above Suspicion takes those cliches and pushes them to the utmost extreme. We're not even out of the opening credits when Susan is telling us in the voiceover narration about the town's economic deprivation since the mines have closed and how there's no opportunities left, and pretty much everyone there is an opioid addict, all while she drives down the main streets surrounded by shop windows that are closed and boarded up. It's that kind of sledgehammer subtlety throughout the entire length of the movie. And at points, it feels like it leans into those tropes so heavily that it frankly becomes cartoonish. It becomes divorced from any kind of reality and just becomes these really hackneyed salt-of-the-earth types in terms of characters, and all of the establishing shots are sweeping over the forest as smoke billows over them. It's frankly ridiculous how cliched it is in this movie, and as if the visuals alone wasn't enough, the filmmakers then slap on horrendous colour grading. All the daylight scenes have this high contrast gunmetal blue filter slapped over them, just in case you weren't aware of how desperate everything is. Just really lacking any kind of subtlety. It got to the point where I was thankful for the night scenes, which are bathed in sickly halogen yellows, because at least then they approximate something looking like resembling natural colour. At least then they are slightly better to look at. I actually found the colour grading in this movie quite hard to look at. But while we're on the subject of the look of this movie, let's talk about the cinematography itself, which I hated from start to finish. There are so many bad choices in this area alone, starting with the sequences where Susan gets high, where the camera adopts a subjective perspective to try and give the audience her POV of sorts, and they do this by dropping the frame rate, so you get really kind of jerky footage, and it just looks horrifically ugly. In fact, there's a moment where this goes on for a straight minute of screen time, a straight minute of characters looking like they're moving at 5 frames per second. It looks so bad on screen. But perhaps the biggest element of the cinematography that really frustrated me is that this movie has almost as many Dutch angle shots as Battlefield Earth. Clearly, at some point, someone went up to the director and the cinematographer and said, hey, I've got a great idea of showing the power imbalance inherent to this story. What if we put the camera at an angle so that Mark is higher in the frame than Susan? And then everyone said, yeah, that's a really great idea. But instead of just using it at key pivotal moments, almost subliminally, what if you use that in virtually every single scene of the movie? The technique is so badly abused throughout the running time to the point where it loses all meaning whatsoever. It's one of those things where once you start noticing it, you genuinely can't stop because it's so ubiquitous. And that's what flummoxes me, because Noyce is experienced enough that surely he knew he was grossly overusing this technique, but it just seems like it's slathered onto the movie to give it a kind of visual interest because dramatically it's lethargic. But that's not the only bad piece of cinematography the film indulges in. It mixes this with shots at fairly random moments where suddenly the actors are in extreme close-up staring right down the barrel of the lens. And I don't know why the film chooses to do this at several moments. I'm not sure what the justification is. It just suddenly happens. So suddenly you're watching a scene that's playing at about a 30-degree angle, and then suddenly it's a straight-on close-up of Emilia Clarke's face. It's very jarring, to say the least, and it just feels incredibly distracting every time it happens. And this is the problem with the cinematography in this movie. Cinematography is not supposed to call attention to itself like this, and yet I found myself really having my attention pulled away from the actual movie itself because the filmmaking was being so abrasive in its approach. There is no need to be so heavy-handed with this kind of material, and it just makes all the faults in the movie that much worse, mixing all these horrible techniques that really have no business being put together this way. And that's the thing, the movie's constantly making these really self-conscious choices that draw attention to themselves rather than actually aid in the story being told, and this continues all the way up to the crucial murder at the film's climax, which is told in two slightly different ways. And in theory, you can sort of understand what they're trying to go for. They're trying to go for a he said, she said perspective on it, but in actuality, in practice, it just makes the audience watch the senseless murder of a woman in two slightly different ways. It doesn't actually add anything to the story or our understanding of the characters to have it play out in this particular way. It's an ambitious idea that thoroughly backfires. It's a big swing and a big miss, but it also exemplifies how the approach to the material is so thoroughly wrong throughout. This is not the way you handle the most crucial event in your narrative. Above Suspicion is a misfire. It is a clear-cut case of a bad script being met with overcompensating direction that tries way too hard to cover for the deficiencies of the story, and as such introduces a whole bunch of extra problems into the mix. The combination of the colour grading and the wonky cinematography and the just plain bad filmmaking in general add up to one of the ugliest movies I can think of in recent memory. I genuinely found it hard to sit through because it looks so putrid on screen, so thoroughly ill-considered in so many of its different choices. If you're a hardcore Emilia Clarke fan, it might be worth seeking out just simply for her performance, because she's trying almost as hard as the direction is, but she is not enough to salvage this utter mess made by people that really ought to know better than this. Phillip, Noyce, what happened here? If you like this review, then you can buy me a Ko-fi, or you can crack the case over at my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks, including access to my Discord server. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.